So I'm just going to share my screen and bring up the PowerPoint. There we go. I think that's all working okay. So as Camilla said in the intro, I'm just going to speak for about 45 minutes on the issue of economic abuse, just because it's still sort of a relatively unknown or misunderstood issue, and then talk a little bit about its policy and practice implications. So I was wanting to start with the definition of economic abuse, and that always kind of starts with a bit of a conversation around the difference, I guess, between financial abuse and economic abuse. So many people will be familiar with the term financial abuse because it's the term that we've used in the sort of policy definition of domestic abuse, certainly since sort of 2008 when the government first put together an action plan around this issue. And I think what really occurred to me through my conversations with victims and survivors was that, yes, absolutely, they were talking about how money and finances were being used as the coercive control against them. But they were also talking about a range of other resources in their lives which were being controlled in very many different ways. So things beyond money and finances, and probably the best way of describing those is being those things that money can buy. So, you know, seeing control of housing, control of transportation, you know, to the very sort of micromanagement of, you know, what food someone could help themselves from a refrigerator or a cupboard, what clothing they were sort of allowed to buy and wear, etc. And it really felt to me as if we were going to recognise this kind of broad range of tactics that perpetrators were using, then actually economic abuse was probably the better term, because that kind of encompassed all of those different sort of targets of control, as we call them in the research literature, so all those different economic resources that perpetrators were targeting. So over the years, sort of the way that I've come to think of it, I guess, is that financial abuse, you know, shouldn't be used with the term economic abuse interchangeably, you know, that they are about the control of different things, but certainly that financial abuse is a subcategory of economic abuse. So economic abuse will include financial control, but also that more broad control around economic resources. And that was really the starting point, sort of very helpfully, when I did kind of take the plunge and set up Surviving Economic Abuse in the January of 2017. This was around the time that Theresa May, who was the Prime Minister at the time, announced that she'd be seeking to bring forward landmark legislation around domestic abuse. So there was a very clear call from Surviving Economic Abuse as a charity from the beginning for economic abuse to be named and defined within the Domestic Abuse Act. And that was something that we were able to achieve quite quickly. Speaking to sort of ministers, several ministers before Rachel Maclean, who we have now, but you know, it felt like something, you know, that did make a difference, but that was sort of non-controversial. You know, it was kind of a welcome suggestion, I think, and something they sort of really led with in terms of their announcements. So we were able to do a lot of awareness raising work around this form of abuse as well, which was really fantastic, because actually for the first time victims and survivors were coming forward and actually being able to name their experiences. And I think, you know, this is the power of being able to name through this work, is that victims and survivors knew it was wrong, but they didn't have a term to describe what was happening to them. And the number of survivors who were in contact, you know, when we started to use this terminology to thank us for it, you know, I think is, you know, you really can't underestimate the significance of that. So here is the statutory definition of domestic abuse then, which is now captured in the Domestic Abuse Act, which received royal assent last April. So it was a long time in the coming, if anyone's kind of already noted the timescales, you know, announced in 2017, but not an act until 2021. And you can see here that it really builds on the policy definition, recognising domestic abuse as either an incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive or threatening behaviour. You know, and the broad scope that that covers in terms of family members and intimate partner violence. What I would say is that I'm going to be focusing on intimate partner violence because that's kind of my area of expertise, but that's not to say, of course, that this isn't an issue that is experienced by family members, and certainly we see a lot of it in the context of honour or so-called honour-based violence as well. Also important to recognise that, you know, domestic abuse can happen to anybody, regardless of gender, sexual orientation or other protected characteristics. But what's really exciting about this definition, obviously from our perspective, is that economic abuse is kind of recognised as part of that pattern of coercive and controlling behaviour. I think what's quite interesting in terms of the definition, which I think this kind of next slide shows, is that sometimes we talk about these different forms of abuse in isolation, but actually something that really struck me when I was speaking to survivors sort of back in 2008 when I started to do this work, was that actually economic abuse kind of threads through and reinforces other forms of coercive and controlling behaviour as well, actually. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why we haven't always noticed it in the same way we might do physical abuse. You know, and certainly, you know, physical abuse can seem more obvious, certainly from those of us who perhaps understand domestic abuse to be physical abuse. You know, that's how we've been brought up to understand it. And certainly, you know, seeing bruises and physical injuries, you know, do demonstrate that particular form of abuse. But certainly through every single conversation I had with a victim or a survivor, and that's kind of what really sort of made me passionate about this work, was that, you know, everyone I spoke to had experienced economic abuse, and they were still kind of living with the impacts of that years after. So you can see how here it threads through, you know, things like intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, you know, very simple things. If you don't have any money to go anywhere or do anything, you know, you're going to stop going out and meeting people. You're not going to have that support system, which we know victims and survivors need. And of course, when abuse escalates, when a victim or survivor perhaps challenges those coercive and controlling tactics, which we see within the rims of this wheel here, we see how it can also overlap with physical violence. So that might be force, you know, to take money from somebody, and it could be physical. So it could be sexual as well as physical violence. So it could be made to perform sexual favours, for example, in exchange for access to basic necessities. So again, this is modelled on the Duluth Power and Control Wheel, and is specific to women's experiences of economic abuse. And something that we're sort of really interested in exploring moving forward is, you know, how different individuals' experiences differ in relation to sex, but also in terms of intersecting characteristics as well. So, you know, I would say this is a sort of a very basic level understanding, and there's so much more still that we need to do to really understand this issue, and how it impacts different individuals, their different sort of makeup, and you know, how we sort of really understand multiple oppressions actually when it comes to responding to this issue as well. So again, very exciting to finally see economic abuse defined within the Domestic Abuse Act, and this very much actually is based on an academic definition of domestic abuse, which has been circulating sort of since about 2008 as well. But you can really see here how government kind of took on our argument that economic abuse was more than just, in inverted commas, control of money and finances. So you can see how here it is described as any behaviour that has a substantial and adverse effect on the victim survivor's ability to acquire, use or maintain money or other property, or obtain goods and services. So you can immediately see, you know, terms like, you know, property here, which covers things such as a mobile phone or a car, goods and services, which might, for example, cover utilities such as heating, and items such as food or clothing. So it really does take on that sort of broad range of characteristics. And what's been really helpful in the research literature over time, and again, it's kind of ever evolving really, and these particular sort of constructs, as we call them, so these different types of behaviour, have kind of taken about 11 years to sort of come to, I would say. So this was in 2019 that we've kind of settled on these different areas, but there's so many different behaviours that sit under economic abuse, but generally we can group them into sort of 3 controlling constructs. So the first of those is restriction, and again, it's probably the one that everyone's probably most familiar with when they think about economic or financial abuse. They'll think of economic dependency, for example, so someone being restricted from having access to economic resources. So that might be not being allowed to go to work, or someone might go to work but not being able to have access to their bank accounts, so they won't have access to their income. They might be prevented from claiming benefits. They might be prevented from, you know, taking the car keys and driving the car when they want to. They might be prevented, as I've already said, from opening the fridge and taking food that they want. So there's a lot of restriction that we see around access to economic resources. And then what I would say that we've seen more and more of over the years, and I think this is kind of a reflection on those who are most vulnerable, sort of being linked to issues linked to inequality. You know, as certain groups have become more equal in society, I think abusers have had to find different ways of kind of controlling their partners. And so what we do see sort of more and more regularly, as I say, is exploitation. So this is where a victim or survivor does go to work and does have access to their bank account, but they're made to cover all household costs. And in my own research, I call this refusing to contribute. So sort of one person paying all sort of household costs in terms of childcare, etc., etc. And then quite often the perpetrator are also making more demands of them. So perhaps insisting that debt is taken out, that sort of loans are applied for, that they're living a lifestyle really beyond their needs. So, we know many victims and survivors who might be working 5 or 6 jobs, hardly getting any sleep in order just to be able to sort of make ends meet, where the perpetrator either does nothing or the perpetrator is similarly building their own economic resources, but not sharing those with the family at all. So might be going off on holiday on their own, engaging in, expensive hobbies and things like that. Whilst the victim survivor and perhaps any children, are actually struggling, to be above the poverty line. So we see a real sort of difference in terms of living standards within houses here, where some people are sort of eating top of the range food and other people being made to sort of eat basic food. And you can just imagine, kind of looking at that power and control wheel that I showed you, the impact, for example, in relation to you emotionally, if someone's making you feel worthless day in, day out in these kind of like symbiotic ways, how difficult that can be over time, sort of, so being made to feel worthless. And also we see victims and survivors being made to work for free. So this is quite often where the perpetrator is the employer and they orchestrate things in such a way that the victim survivor doesn't get any pay for their work. And I think, some really interesting overlaps here with things like modern slavery and other forms of violence against women and girls. And then sabotage as well. So I've already talked about sort of debts and loans being taken out in victim survivors' names. That can be with their knowledge, but obviously in a context where it's dangerous for them to say no, or it could be without their knowledge as well. And we see hundreds of thousands of pounds of debt, unfortunately, for some individuals, which obviously has a negative impact on sort of credit ratings. It can lead to bankruptcy. So a sort of a real sabotage to someone's prospects, because one of the things about, trying to create, the opposite of economic abuse, trying to create economic safety is about maximising access to economic resources, and we all know how important, credit is, as an insurance policy in many ways for us all. So not to have access to that sort of form of income or support or, safety net moving forward, is really, really important. Thing that we sort of need to address, certainly when a credit rating has been destroyed through no fault of your own. It's not a reflection of your behaviour, which is what a credit rating should show. And also we see sabotage in perpetrators kind of deliberately destroying items which have to be paid for, so replaced. So things like televisions and mobile phones, they're quite costly, and if you have to keep replacing them, because you need a mobile phone, for example, that can take away sort of available income in the same way that paying back debt can as well. So really, we don't often see these in isolation again. Usually these are kind of all interrelated as well. So it's likely that victims and survivors will be experiencing a combination of these different forms of behaviour. I just wanted to give some examples here of successful prosecutions of the coercive and controlling behaviour offence, which was introduced in 2015 and really does kind of reflect our understanding of domestic abuse as a pattern of controlling or coercive behaviour. And something that we did back in 2017 was analyse those successful prosecutions just to get a sense of how economic abuse was kind of threading through those examples of coercive and controlling behaviour. And we found that 6 in 10 of successful prosecutions involved at least one element of economic abuse. And there's just some examples here. So I think, it's really sort of also shows, not only has our understanding changed over time, but also our ability to prosecute, some of these things on their own obviously aren't crimes, but when you take them within this context of coercive and controlling behaviour, and you look at the impact that that has on a victim or a survivor, you can start to see how, finally legislation is kind of starting to create a context where we can start, addressing some of these behaviours and punishing perpetrators accordingly. And I suppose what's really important to say also around economic abuse is that it's particularly common post-separation. So Evan Stark, who coined the term sort of coercive control in the research literature, talks about how it doesn't require physical proximity in the same way as other forms of abuse. So, for example, physical abuse. So, you know, a victim survivor could have fled, the perpetrator might have no idea where they are, but they're still able to control their economic resources. And that could be through things like, you know, sale of a joint property, a joint tenancy, a joint bank account, taking out credit. Again, if you know someone's intimate details, you might have access to their log-on details for their bank account, etc., etc. So you can see how, you know, when someone has that intimate knowledge of someone and access to certain information, how they can continue to control their ex-partner through economic abuse. And so for that reason, again, as a charity, once we'd achieved the recognition of economic abuse within the Act, we then pushed for an amendment via the Act to the Serious Crime Act of 2015, so that coercive or controlling behaviour could also be recognised post-separation. So up until now, it can only be prosecuted if you're living with or in a relationship with the perpetrator and not after having moved out. You know, which seems, you know, very nonsensical for those of us who are familiar with the issue of domestic abuse, because of course we know that the point of separation and immediately thereafter is the riskiest time for victims and survivors, when they're most at risk of homicide as well. So really important that we have a mechanism to hold perpetrators accountable for that behaviour whilst the victim survivor still lives or is in a relationship with them, but also afterwards when this form of abuse is particularly prevalent. So moving on to some of the impacts of economic abuse then. And again, I kind of started to talk a little bit about this when I talked about the different kind of constructs of control that we've identified. So some, you know, through restriction, for example, create that economic dependency that I talked about, that we're probably all familiar with, you know, somebody who doesn't have access to any economic resources at all. But it also can create economic instability. You know, so this is someone who might, you know, have a lot of economic resources, as I've said. They might have a high paid job, you know, they might have a nice house and a nice car. But if the perpetrator is refusing to contribute to household costs, if they're having to sort of live beyond their means, it might be that, you know, they're spending all their time, as I said, kind of working to pay the bills. So in the same way as somebody who doesn't have a job can't access £100 at short notice, someone who might have a job and be earning a lot of money still can't access that £100 at short notice, because actually that money's already been paid out somewhere else. So whether it's creating dependency or creating instability, you know, in some ways it has no material effect on, you know, the here and now of the victim or survivor, and in some ways might be more challenging if they're sort of in the negative, you know, have a negative balance, because it stops them from, you know, fundamentally having the spare income that they need to leave and to be safe. So they still don't have the money, you know, to put the petrol in the car or to buy the bus ticket, you know, to pay for accommodation overnight, and to even think about how they might set up and establish another household and support any children within it. You know, you can see how it is a real challenge. And we see that in terms of how that translates into both physical and psychological safety. So again, you know, I would argue that over the years we haven't talked about economic abuse because people have kind of seen it as a lesser form of violence in some ways, not as important and detrimental as physical or sexual abuse, for example. But actually, if you can't remove yourself from a situation you're in, you're going to experience more harm purely because you're in that situation. So we know that those women who experience economic abuse are 5 times more likely to experience physical abuse, because the perpetrator kind of recognises that and takes advantage of it. We know that women who experience economic abuse in the context of coercive control are at increased risk of homicide. And we know that women who experience any form of economic abuse in the context of domestic abuse are also more likely to take their own lives. So, you know, we would argue very much that economic safety underpins physical safety. And I think it's really important. And actually, you know, the plan that Camilla made note of in her introduction, the domestic abuse plan published today, actually recognises for the first time those survivors who will take their own life as well. You know, we know that at least, you know, since COVID, more than 2 women a week are now killed by a current or a former partner. And certainly when we start adding suicide to that as well, you can just see, you know, the detrimental impact of domestic abuse generally, but how economic abuse as a risk factor increases the likelihood. You know, so I would never sort of advocate for a hierarchy of harm, as I call it. We really need to kind of recognise how these different forms of abuse all come together and create that kind of entrapment, again, that Evan Stark talks about, that kind of freedom crime that stops victims and survivors from making the choices that they want to be able to make. And for that reason, I would also argue that it's very unlikely that you'll ever see economic abuse without emotional abuse alongside. Again, I think I gave that example of, being able to help yourself to food from the fridge. If you can't meet your most basic needs, the emotional terror of how you're going to meet your needs or your children's needs is always going to be with you. And, the emotional impact of that, is very difficult as well, as it is in relation to economic well-being more generally, which I'll move on to. Because again, what we see is, victims and survivors who might have been very, very capable in terms of managing their finances, no problems at all before they met the perpetrator, might have been belittled, told over and over again that they can't manage their finances, that they're not good at managing resources. They, through behaviour, they can be made to feel worthless and to kind of lack confidence. So something that we do see is a real sort of lack of money knowledge and confidence among victims and survivors. So some, who I've just said were very capable before and have had their confidence absolutely undermined. But also those who might not have ever had an opportunity to control their own finances and economic resources more broadly. And so are kind of having to start from scratch. And, we speak to banks and building societies, who will support a survivor, to use a cash point machine for the first time, for example. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done after a victim or survivor has left. And as I said, our research has now shown that 95% of domestic abuse victims experience economic abuse. So again, I would really argue from a kind of prevention perspective that, we would most likely see economic and emotional abuse potentially before physical or sexual violence. So if we're going to really sort of focus on prevention efforts, it's another reason why we really need to think about the control of economic resources and the importance of, really understanding what that looks like. So victims and survivors might might recognise their experiences a little bit earlier before it does escalate, into that kind of understanding of abuse, which perhaps we're all a bit more familiar with. As I've said, 60% of economic abuse victims are coerced into debt, so that has implications on a long-term basis. I've met survivors who've spent decades paying back, debt, money that was taken out in their name that they've never seen or used to procure sort of goods or services that they've never had access to. And obviously that has an ongoing impact, not only because every time that money's taken out of your bank account on an ongoing basis, it's a reminder of the abuse and the ongoing control, but also because it limits your ability to live the life that you want to, because you're constantly still paying out even after having left the abuser. So it seems particularly unfair, and it was the real sort of focus of our first piece of work as an organisation. We also see how a lot of survivors will struggle to get back into work. So as well as perhaps have been prevented from work in the first place and not having kind of the work experience and the skills to go back to work, there are those whose work might have been sabotaged, so they might have been fired. So there might be particular challenges in terms of getting back into the workplace. Certainly we know, and especially because of economic abuse, some survivors will be driven to offend in order to survive, so things like shoplifting, not paying the TV licence, will all be linked to economic abuse. So, that's kind of another area where, building kind of safety up again is really important. And for those of you who are not aware of the Employers Domestic Abuse Covenant, I just wanted to pop that in there because that's a particular scheme which government's supporting, which helps people to re-enter the workplace after experiencing domestic abuse. So that's worth signing up to if you're not aware of it. And then, of course, new risks arising, again, the sort of the popular, well, why don't you just leave piece, doesn't mean, as we've already discussed, that the abuse will end. Coercive control will continue post-separation. But also when you have particular issues, in relation to your economic well-being, other risks can also become apparent. So again, I've spoken to victims and survivors who've moved in with a new partner much sooner than they wanted to, but actually, surviving on their own, sometimes as parents, is such a struggle that actually it makes more sense, to share those costs with a new partner. So, that might mean that they move in with someone, sooner than they wanted to, and perhaps have really got to know them. We see the threat of loan sharks and the sort of illegal lenders, sexual exploitations. If you're not paying your rent, the landlord will say, you can, settle that debt by sleeping with me, for example. So, without sort of addressing economic safety on an ongoing basis, not only are we kind of failing to support victims and survivors from the experiences that they have fled from, but also we're not stopping their potential exposure to other threats moving forward. Again, I think that makes it a really important issue for that reason. So just thinking about who is at risk then, obviously anybody is at risk of any form of abuse. What's particularly interesting about economic abuse, of course, is because of that lack of physical proximity, but also kind of that lack of physical aspect, I guess, of abuse, it being, you know, something that isn't necessarily intertwined with physical abuse, as I said, although it can be. You know, that does mean there is more potential, for example, for men to experience economic abuse, you know, compared to physical abuse, for example, for that reason. And what we do see again in terms of domestic abuse is that, you know, perpetrators will basically seek to kind of reduce or, you know, disappear completely someone's sort of social, personal and economic resources. So they might sort of, you know, make their kind of focus on economic resources, but, you know, at the same time, as I've already explained, that kind of emotional impact of economic abuse means that there'll be a negative impact on someone's kind of personal resources, so, you know, their personal self-esteem, their confidence, their belief that, you know, they do deserve someone who treats them nicely. So, you know, that can really have a limiting impact on their ability to kind of act for themselves. And of course, their sort of social resources, because, you know, again, I talked a little bit to isolation. You know, if you're losing friends, family, colleagues at work, you know, other people who could potentially help you, you know, not only are you kind of losing their support, but you're also losing the, you know, kind of like their emotional support, I guess, but also there's that physical support. So again, one of the real surprises that I've had, I suppose, in terms of setting up the charity, is that I was so used to working in community-based services that I wasn't really sort of aware of victims and survivors who had had a lot of money, who had had property, and who, because of their kind of social networks, were able to kind of, you know, move between different friends' houses, perhaps house sit for people who had more than 2 properties. They were still homeless, but in a very different way. Which meant that when they went to the community-based settings for support, there was very little that a community-based setting could do for them, because certainly on paper, it looked as if they had a lot of resources to their name, because this might be during a period, you know, for example, where there might be a separation, sort of awaiting a divorce resettlement. So, you know, I just think it's really sort of interesting, you know, certainly when I first sort of heard from survivors who talked about how their children had to, you know, leave a private sort of education, you know, it was a real sort of eye-opener, I guess, for me to kind of recognise, you know, how I'd always known that this impacted all stratas of society, but actually the different ways in which economic abuse can play out. And in some ways, the more destitute you are, the more support there is available. And so it's been particularly interesting, as I say, to see what support is available for different parts of society in different spaces as well. But of course, and unsurprisingly, you know, as we know around domestic abuse more generally, you know, those who lack power, so have some kind of experience some kind of inequality, are going to be at increased risk of economic abuse, which is why we do see more women experiencing economic abuse compared to men, because historically, you know, it's not that long ago that they weren't able to have credit in their name or to take out a house jointly without, I think, the permission of their husband or their father. You know, traditionally in sort of lower paid jobs, having caring responsibilities, you know, not having those same level of resources that men do, which makes them particularly vulnerable. But also when we think about different protected characteristics, and then we start to think about how those intersect, you know, we can start to see how, you know, particular groups in society, so those with different sexualities or with a disability, who might be younger, you can start to see how there's particular barriers for them around access to economic resources as well. So when you kind of take some of those characteristics together and you start to see how they intersect, you can see how it becomes particularly difficult for some groups to access those economic resources they need. So, you know, you might be struggling to get into the workforce, but you might be a Black woman who's been discriminated against in terms of going for a job, so that's going to make it even more difficult. You might be a disabled man, you might be a gay man. Economic abuse is particularly disproportionately impacts gay men. So it's really important again, and we don't know enough about this, and again, it's an area that we really need to understand. We really need to sort of start thinking about, you know, kind of tailoring our individuals our interventions rather for individuals, and thinking about their sort of particular location with kind of these intersecting inequalities, because we'll be having to deal with those kind of multiple oppressions and multiple discriminations when we're supporting victims and survivors to be safe. You know, it won't be as simple, you know, as just helping someone get a job. You'll have to really think about how you support them as an individual back into the workplace as well. But I suppose what's also really important to flag here, and you know, it can be quite difficult in the research literature to kind of work out the direction of travel, but you know, the experience of domestic abuse or coercive control can create inequality. So actually, a lot of victims and survivors, as I've already said, might have had a lot of resources but are reduced to poverty, and are living a very sort of different life to that they experienced. And those similarly at risk of poverty might be sort of preyed upon by abusers who would take advantage of a potential sort of dependency that they might have on them economically. So it's sort of really important, I think, to kind of recognise that, you know, there is that risk attached to inequality, but at the same time, you know, an experience of domestic abuse can create that inequality as well, and then kind of perpetuate that vulnerability moving forward as well. So I said I'd talk a little bit to the policy implications. So this is my very hurried slide late last night when we received our embargo copy of the domestic abuse plan, which the Home Office has published today. And actually, in some ways, I know when you said at the beginning, Camilla, it's amazing what can happen in 5 years. Well, certainly in 2016, when the government had a violence against women and girls strategy, which domestic abuse still sat within, and that's no longer the case. And before it had been, domestic abuse had been removed from the strategy, and now it would appear, even though apparently words aren't particularly important, but I would still consider it to be slightly downgraded to a plan versus a strategy. Actually, economic abuse wasn't even named within sort of the last action plan in 2016. There's kind of a fleeting reference to how victim survivors might have problems with debts, for example, but that is literally the only kind of reference to economic abuse within that plan, and it certainly isn't named as being, you know, linked to economic abuse, shall we say. So to actually see today's plan, you know, despite its many limitations, and to see that actually one of the problems that's conceptualised within that are that victims and survivors will experience negative health, emotional, economic and social impacts, is really significant, actually, because we've seen sort of a recognition of the health, and more recently, I guess, a recognition of the emotional impacts, but certainly not of the economic. So it's fantastic to see that. And obviously there's an objective now that sits within that under supporting victims, which does look at how victims and survivors can be supported to get back to life as normal in relation both to their health, their emotional, economic and social needs. So it does feel as if through, you know, legislation coming before the plan, we kind of have a framework now through which to respond to economic abuse, and it's sort of laid out in a way that's sort of almost a clear expectation, which I think is really important. As I said, that kind of hierarchy of harm, to actually start talking about economic harm and impacts, you know, in the same sentence as physical and emotional abuse as well. And you can see here that there's 5 broad categories of support that the government has identified within the supporting victims objective, one of those being economic and housing support. You know, I would argue that, you know, housing would sit within economic anyway, and certainly support in the workplace, you know, I think is also particularly relevant to this issue as well. But, you know, fantastic to see that focus, as I said. So I think some of the things that we'll sort of be pushing for as an organisation in terms of kind of the policy context moving forward is really seeing that economic safety also reflected in the upcoming National Statement of Expectations. So that's the kind of guidance that local areas are provided on how to commission support services for victims, survivors of all forms of VAWG. So I would very much hope that with kind of this recognition within the plan, that's reflected across now into the National Statement of Expectations, and more is done to support victims and survivors around their economic safety and wellbeing moving forward. I would also argue, and I'll move to this in a minute, in relation to the practice piece, that we really need to broaden our coordinated community response model to domestic abuse, so that we're involving what I would call the non-traditional stakeholders, such as debt and money advice services, because they are so absolutely integral to this work that I don't think we can see them as kind of another sector over here that we kind of engage with. I think they have to be integral to the work that we're doing. And of course, there's a need to understand this or to translate rather, this understanding now of economic abuse into linked policy. So policy that's already gone before, but which doesn't contain this understanding of economic abuse. Obviously, you can see how the no recourse to public funds issue is such a massive fail. You know, it continues to be discriminatory against migrant women who can't access funds. And so, you know, economic control is just, you know, ever so prevalent and detrimental for them, because there's no kind of safety net as there is for the rest of the population in relation to welfare benefits. But, you know, problems with universal credit when that's paid to couples in a single payment. Access to refuges for working women, because again, we know the rent's so high, it's difficult for working women to be able to afford the rent, and quite often have to give up their job. And certainly from an economic safety perspective, that's the last thing they need to be doing. Issues around legal aid and the means test, again, which means that those who look like they have resources on paper but who actually don't have access to them can't benefit from legal aid either. And we often see victims and survivors, you know, sort of going through lengthy divorce settlements only to kind of put all their financial settlement, you know, into their legal bills and actually be no better off, and question why they even went through it in the first place. And also child maintenance, which is a massive mechanism for ongoing control post-separation, which I hope is really kind of spotlighted when we really think about coercive control post-separation, because it's kind of one of the key ways the victims and survivors continue to be controlled after they've left an abuser. I just wanted to mention really quickly a report that we published earlier this month. I was thinking, gosh, what month are we in? But yes, it's only April at the end of the week, isn't it? So we're still in March. But this was around legal rights and remedies for economic abuse. So it's kind of taking our understanding of economic abuse as a form of coercive control and behaviour, and actually saying, you know, how can we address it through the criminal justice system, but also the civil justice system as well? And are there other routes of redress? I've talked a lot about a sort of coerced debt, which, you know, is very much linked to consumer law as well. And as things currently stand, you know, the contract is between the provider of the credit and the person who takes the credit out. So undue influence from a third party plays no role at all within this. It's very sort of black and white, so no duress will be taken into consideration because it's from a party outside of the parties who were involved in the contract. So there's kind of a lot of work to be done in that space as well, and some real interesting intersections. Again, you know, we know through our work with banks and building societies, for example, you know, a family court might make an order for a property to be transferred into a victim or survivor's name, but the banks themselves can't do that unless the victim survivor passes the affordability test, which quite often they can't do through a single income, which means that court order can't actually be enacted. So there's some really interesting sort of intersections between kind of different legal sort of systems and laws themselves, which really need to be addressed if we're going to address this issue in the way that it needs to be. Which moves me into the practice implications quite well. And I suppose what I would say is, you know, certainly our work at C is that we work on a number of different levels. And this is really inspired by a piece of work that I actually went to the Child and Women Abuse Studies unit to do. It feels like many years ago now, probably about 10 years ago. But it was a project where we tracked victims and survivors' experiences of rebuilding their lives for 3 years after leaving an abuser. And you can see here that we looked across what we called different spaces for action. So, you know, the opposite of coercive control being space for action. So, you know, the less coercive control, the more space for action you would have. And, you know, we wanted to test whether space for action increased after leaving. And as you can see, it did across a number of domains, but ongoing coercive control meant that it didn't in the way that we would like it to have done. And also the context within which survivors were rebuilding their lives was actually a time when the country had just gone into austerity, and we had a coalition government and lots of cuts were being made. And actually that kind of safety net that I talked about that used to exist through things like crisis loans and things like that really started to disappear, and we started to see how that impacted survivors' space for action over time. And as you can see, sort of economic abuse, which is that kind of green sort of line, or economic space for action rather, was an area that sort of started low and remained quite low over time because of that ongoing control, as I said, particularly economic abuse post-separation, but also that context within the welfare state that wasn't supporting those efforts very well at all. So what we try and do at Surviving Economic Abuse is to support the individual, you know, through advocacy, and then identify perhaps with an organisation, what more the organisation could do, if there's any particular barriers that an organisation is preventing from being addressed, or perhaps an industry, or perhaps government. We kind of look at the different barriers at different levels and seek to dismantle them as we're supporting a victim or a survivor. So that work in and of itself is quite complicated, but something again that's really struck me since setting up the charity is that victims and survivors are dealing with so many different things at so many different levels. And it was during a roundtable actually where we brought a group together to talk to Home Office officials that I recognised for the first time actually, that not only were they simultaneously dealing with the impact of economic abuse, so kind of having left, you know, not having access to economic resources anymore, suddenly discovering that they were in thousands of pounds worth of debt and having to deal with that. So that was one problem, but then they were experiencing other forms of economic abuse post-separation, which was making it very difficult to deal with the situation that they'd just left, and this kind of adding to the difficulty that they were experiencing. And as I say, you know, this kind of control happening within a context where, you know, the state wasn't supporting victims and survivors again to access their you know, to access economic resources in the way that they needed to, and quite often systems you know, were set up in such a way which continued that control for a victim or a survivor. So I'm just going to move across to financial services quickly here, because I think it's a really good example actually of how those sort of mechanisms or policies and practices continue that control. So one of the bigger ones, which I'm sure you'll all be aware of, you know, are kind of joint financial products and how difficult it is, you know, when a victim or survivor leaves. So until sort of 2018, certainly, you know, if you had a joint bank account, you know, you couldn't remove one party from that joint bank account without their consent. You know, perpetrators were refusing to give consent, and victims and survivors were basically having to sort of freeze bank accounts, which was very, very difficult. So in 2018, UK Finance, which is an organisation like the membership organisation for banks, consulted with members, and they developed a code of practice around how they should be responding to financial abuse, which is what we talk about in the bank space because it's obviously to do with finances. And that's been a real game changer. So now, you know, banks will remove one party without their permission. Where someone has been coerced into debt, where there's evidence of that, then a victim or survivor will be relieved of that debt. In some cases, the bank will actually then pursue the perpetrator for the monies instead. You know, they'll do things like open a bank account without, you know, a formal means of proving who you are. You know, they'll go by some other documentation. And it's really started to create a change around sort of our ability to support victims and survivors. So I suppose when I talked about, you know, organisationally, what a particular bank would do, and here on an industry level now, actually what, you know, the industry expects different banks to do. As I say, it has been a real game changer, and it's kind of really helped the customer vulnerability agenda sort of happening alongside this work on the bill. It's created a real momentum of change, so much so that actually, and this is kind of one of the things that I'm particularly proud of, is that we supported Lloyds Banking Group, which is kind of the largest you know, group in the country. 1 in 4 of us will bank with somehow with Lloyds Banking Group. Now have a specialist domestic and financial abuse team with 12 members of a team now, who provide specialist support to customers who experience financial abuse. So we kind of trained and support that team, and a member of our team works within it. And through Home Office funding, again, because of the Act, we've been able to support the vulnerable customer teams of 11 financial abuse firms now as well. So again, we're really starting to see the difference that makes for a victim and a survivor. But obviously that work needs to happen in the domestic abuse space as well. So really important that domestic abuse services are training staff around economic abuse. That's still not really happening. General conversations are had, perhaps when you're talking about welfare benefits, for example, or the no recourse to public funds rule. But, you know, this kind of level of understanding, I think, is really important. So we have developed a screening tool for economic abuse to help services really gauge, you know, how prevalent this issue is. As I said, you know, our findings are consistently that 95% of victims and survivors will be experiencing economic abuse. So really important that support plans and safety plans actually address that as well, which, you know, again, traditionally hasn't always been the case. And that's through no fault of victim or survivor services at all. But, you know, the way in which, you know, funding is set up, you know, risk is managed, is that there's that focus on physical abuse and economic abuse, and safety has been a little bit neglected within that. So things like organisational responses to domestic abuse, you know, are there, hardship funds, if a victim survivor does have to come to access support, do they have the bus fare to actually get to you to access that support in the first place? And we've also worked with local services to develop and pilot specialist roles. So we had a coerced debt specialist within Solace Women's Aid, which has morphed into an economic abuse specialist, and they're making a real difference in terms of supporting caseworkers around this issue. Also the development of partnerships, which I talked about in relation to the coordinated community response. Again, everyone acts with the best of intentions, but it's illegal to give debt advice if you're not accredited to do so. In the same way, it's illegal to give immigration advice. And quite often we see services kind of moving into giving the debt advice space, which really is a bit of a risk as a service. So really important to work with money and debt advice organisations, but to ensure that they really understand the needs of victims and survivors to do that work safely. So that's another area of work that we've been supporting. And also an economic abuse evidence form. So this is modelled on the mental health evidence form, and basically means that a trained debt advisor can sign a form to say that someone's experienced economic abuse, which is then given to a creditor, and then the creditor uses that information to decide what they're going to do. So we know on average that a victim or survivor will have 5 different creditors. So up until now, they've had to explain to 5 different people why they're in debt, perhaps share an awful lot of information to try and prove that they've experienced economic abuse, and might have then different answers from those 5 different creditors. So the idea of the evidence form is that they only have to tell one person once. That information is shared with multiple creditors, and they operate from an understanding that economic abuse has happened, which means they will all respond from that understanding, versus 2 who will say yes, we believe you, and 3 who say no, we don't. So that's really important in terms of consistent responses for victims and survivors. So I just wanted to end very quickly by talking a little bit about the support offered by C. So we're not a frontline organisation, although we do have frontline partnerships, but we're very much about building the capacity of others to respond. Not only is that across the financial services sector and the domestic abuse sector, but anywhere where there's money involved, which is pretty much every aspect of life. There are different ways of recognising economic abuse in that context and supporting professionals to recognise those signs, and to think about how they might support a victim or survivor. So we produce a range of resources for victims and survivors and professionals across a range of different sectors. As I said, we have a frontline partnership with Money Advice Plus, where we provide a financial support line and casework service for victims of domestic abuse in financial difficulty. Because of our partnership with Lloyds Banking Group, we can refer into that specialist team, but we also have great contacts with the vulnerability teams of other high street and online banks. So again, if you're ever supporting a client, we've got some great resources about how to get to the right person. But if you're really struggling, again, we can help facilitate that. And we also have a team of specialists who work at the charity with specialisms in things like benefits and debt, housing, banking and insurance. So again, if you as an organisation have any sort of complex casework that you needed support with, we'd be able to signpost and make suggestions in relation to that as well. And we're always sort of on the lookout for people who might be able to pilot the economic abuse evidence form. So clients who might be in considerable debt. What we've been able to do through that pilot is to ask for it to be written off. That was something that we always used to do, but it would take many days, if not months. But our pilot is showing sort of turnarounds in a couple of weeks now, which just makes, again, a huge difference for victims and survivors to have those issues dealt with sooner rather than later. So that's me. Details of our website, our email if you want to get in contact with us as well, and how you can also follow us on social media.